The unintentional record breaker, the first run of the Silver Jubilee. This is a story of how vision, the desire to succeed, and the late delivery of a vital component culminated in one of the most remarkable events in railway history. I love it because it shows how excellence can be achieved in the most unexpected of ways. The year is 1934. Despite the Great Depression, the senior management of the London and North Eastern Railway were looking to the future. The London and North Eastern Railway, or LNER as it was called, was one of the big four railway companies in the United Kingdom. Its main line stretched all the way from London to Newcastle and then on into Scotland to Edinburgh and beyond. The company was keenly aware that a sizable market was opening up for high-speed travel. If they didn't modernise quickly, then it seemed certain that they would start losing passengers to a new, rapidly developing mode of transport, the airlines. On the continent, railways were at the forefront of development. In 1932, the Germans started testing a two-car diesel-electric high-speed railcar set. Within a year, a new service had been opened between Berlin and Hamburg. It was an immediate sensation. It covered the 180 miles, about 285 kilometres, between these great cities at an average speed of just under 80 miles per hour. That's about 125 kilometres per hour. This was a remarkable speed for the time. During tests, a top speed of 103 miles per hour, about 165 kilometres per hour, had been achieved. The train, the Flying Hamburger, was such a success that over the next few years 30 more train sets were built. In September 1934, the chairman, general manager and chief mechanical engineer of the LNER went over to Germany to experience the service firsthand. They hadn't just gone along for the ride. They were interested in checking out the train's performance. This was because they were scoping out a plan to implement their own high-speed services between London and Leeds, and also between London and Newcastle. The proposed schedule for the London to Newcastle service was 4 hours. This was extremely ambitious. Even today, the average journey time between the two cities is around 3.5 hours, with the fastest times being a bit under 3 hours. Things must have gone well because the German manufacturers sent a detailed quote to the LNER head office sometime during October. However, what was promised turned out to be quite disappointing. The railcar wouldn't be able to match the 4-hour schedule. The best that it could do would be to complete the journey in 4 hours and 15 minutes. The final nail in the coffin was that the chief mechanical engineer of the LNER, Sir Nigel Gresley, had been very unimpressed with the cramped seating arrangements. He reckoned that the British public weren't going to give up their comfort and the possibility of having a good meal in a dining car simply for a bit of extra speed. When the board met at the end of the month, Sir Nigel told them that he could do a better job more cheaply using steam power. By the end of the following month, the first of a series of test runs was undertaken. On the 30th of November 1934, the Flying Scotsman set off on a high-speed trip from London to Leeds and back again. It was on this journey that railway history was made. The Flying Scotsman became the first steam engine to officially break the 100 miles per hour, that's 160 kilometres per hour, barrier. However, the engine was driven flat out, far beyond its normal limits. It would have been completely uneconomical to have tried to repeat this performance day in and day out as part of a normal service. But What was important was that the German schedule had easily been beaten using a conventional steam engine with 3 carriages and a dining car in tow. The test runs were completed by early March 1935. Within a few days, the development program for the high-speed service was given the go-ahead. The train was to be named the Silver Jubilee, to coincide with the Silver Jubilee of King George V, who had been crowned king 25 years earlier in 1910. The engine and carriages were to be decked out in silver grey livery to match the name. The first city to be linked to London would be Newcastle. The date for the first run, with fare-paying passengers, was set for Monday the 30th of September 1935. This was a mere 6 months away. What could possibly go wrong with such an ambitious project that involved so much groundbreaking work in so many areas of technical innovation? The mechanical drawings of the new class of engines and the special carriages for the train were started in April. The frames for the first engine were laid on the 26th of June. The time pressure was immense. It was only on the 17th of September that the first of the new engines, Silver Link, was turned out of the company's workshops in Doncaster. With less than 2 weeks to go before the first public run, this was cutting things mighty fine, to say the least. But there was one other vital matter that made the schedule even more hair-raising, especially as it had been planned with such a huge fanfare by the LNER publicity department. A demonstration run had been organised for Friday the 27th of September. This meant that instead of nearly 2 weeks, there was only 10 days to check for faults and to make sure that the engine was properly run in. The special train was scheduled to run from King's Cross Station in London down the LNER main line to the town of Grantham, a distance of just over 100 miles, that is 160 kilometres. After a short layover, it was then scheduled to return to King's Cross. In those days, railways were much more at the centre of life than they are today. Since the event had been so widely publicised, large crowds flocked to King's Cross Station to catch a glimpse of the new train. As the time to leave approached, members of the press, senior officers of the company, well-known recorders of train times and other luminaries began to get on board. Yes, in those days, recording the speed of express trains was an important pastime. Several of the recorders achieved celebrity status, at least in railway circles. What greeted those lucky enough to have gone to the station was not only a masterpiece of engineering, but a work of art. The silver carriages were sleek and air-smoothed in design. The engine, quietly simmering at the head of the train, was unlike anything that they had ever seen before. Gone was the normal chunky outline of a steam locomotive. In its stead, there stood an ultra-modern streamlined machine that looked like it was going to transport them into a new age. Even today, the beautifully proportioned lines of these engines still make them look modern and up to date. What was interesting from a mechanical point of view was that the steam pipes to and from the cylinders and the cylinders themselves had been carefully redesigned. It could be said that the internal streamlining was even more advanced than the external. There was one novel detail of particular interest. The tender of the engine had an inbuilt corridor that meant that on long journeys crews could swap over. Although this was to be a publicity run, there was absolutely no intention of making any attempt at a speed record. In fact, quite the opposite. The general manager of the LNER was at pains to point out to all and sundry boarding the special service that this is not a stunt train. However, there were two seemingly small events that were to have a big impact on the day's proceedings. Firstly, the driver, Arthur Taylor, was asked to go a little bit faster than normal to make sure that the engine had enough in hand to make up for lost time if it were to be delayed. Secondly, the only significant piece of apparatus that wasn't ready on time was the speedometer cum speed recorder. It was quite a complex instrument and, due to production delays, wouldn't be ready for another week or so. At 14:25, Arthur Taylor gave a blast on the whistle. As well as his fireman, Jack Luty, there was a traction inspector on the footplate. Photos of the time show that the platform was so crowded that people were standing beyond the ramp at its end, almost on the rails themselves. Modern-day safety experts would have had a fit. Despite it being uphill, the engine pulled the 385-ton, 7-coach train out of King's Cross at a brisk pace. As the train climbed the steep gradient through a series of tunnels and past Finsbury Park Station, about 2.5 miles out, in record time, the seasoned train recorders must have had thought that the chances were quite good that they could be in for a fast run. What was clear was that the new high-speed train was going significantly faster than the top expresses that it was designed to replace. Although the gradients over the next 17 miles, from Finsbury Park to Hatfield, were quite mild, they were generally against the engine. Despite this, the speed of the train kept rising. The expresses of the day normally passed through Hatfield Station at speeds of about 70 miles per hour or so. That's about 110 to 115 kilometres per hour. When the high-speed train rocketed through Hatfield Station at 95 miles per hour, just over 150 kilometres per hour, those on board recording its speed must have begun to feel a mounting sense of excitement. This was going to be a special trip. Even so, none of them could have even imagined the events that were going to unfold. By this time, the upper management of the LNER would have been settling back in their seats and making themselves comfortable. They were probably starting to daydream about all the positive articles that will be published in the travel sections of the Saturday morning newspapers. Little did they know that within 24 hours that the exploits of the Silver Jubilee would be splashed across the front page of just about every major newspaper in the world. As the train approached Hitchin Station, about 32 miles out of London, everything on the engine seemed to be going pretty well. Nothing was running hot and the engine was steaming freely. Since there was no speedometer fitted, the driver and traction inspector had simply been estimating their speed. The ride on the new engine had been remarkably smooth. This was because the engineers at the Doncaster Works had made a point of paying special attention to its suspension in order to ensure that it rode steadily at the higher speeds envisaged. In fact, the engine was riding so smoothly that the traction inspector was concerned that it was being worked too lightly. He must have been conscious of his instructions that they needed to check whether the engine had enough in reserve to make up for lost time. So he leaned forward, tapped Arthur on the shoulder, and indicated that the regulator, that is the accelerator, should be opened out just a little bit more. Arthur has left quite an extensive account of what happened that day. His words make interesting reading. I thought that the Pathé Gazette aeroplane flying beside us was pulling my leg when it began to fall behind, just after we had passed through Hitchin Station. Arthur kept driving the engine with the same regulator setting. By all accounts, the engine continued to ride smoothly. So they must have thought that they were continuing to travel at about 90 miles per hour. That's about 140 kilometres per hour. impressively fast, considering that the regulator could have been opened out a great deal more. Arthur was probably still wondering why the pilot of the plane had let the train get so far ahead when he felt another tap on his shoulder. He looked around and did a double take. There, standing on the footplate, was none other than the boss, Sir Nigel. What possible reason could Sir Nigel have for wanting to talk to someone like him? A large smile broke out over Sir Nigel's face. "I think that you should ease your arm, young man. There are some rather nervous elderly gentlemen back in the train." With that, Sir Nigel turned around and headed back through the corridor to his seat on the train. So, why had Sir Nigel decided to come on the footplate and ask the driver to slow down? The fact was that the train was going far faster than the traction inspector or the driver had realised. Just before hitching, the train had crossed the magic 100 miles per hour mark. That's 160 kilometres per hour. But this was no momentary blip, like the speed record achieved when the Flying Scotsman was thrashed to her limit. On the contrary, the train's speed continued to climb rapidly. After another mile, they were doing 107 miles per hour. That's just over 170 kilometres per hour. The next 20 miles of track was lightly undulating and included a few slight adverse gradients. The speed over this section varied between 107 and 112.5 miles per hour. That's roughly between 170 to 180 kilometres per hour. Nothing like it had ever been seen with steam traction before. What is even more remarkable is that these phenomenal speeds had been achieved even though the regulator setting was relatively light. Here was an engine on its first run that had been driven well within its limits, and yet it had twice exceeded 112 miles per hour on basically level track. Once again, it's very interesting to hear Arthur Taylor's own words. "I was not worrying about breaking any records. If I'd known that I was going over 112 miles per hour and they had asked me to go faster, then I could easily have gone over 120 miles per hour. That's 195 kilometres per hour. It seems that driver Taylor had simply allowed his engine to find something like its natural top cruising speed. There is one more interesting fact about this record-breaking run that explains why Sir Nigel had come onto the footplate to talk to the driver. Although the engine had been riding smoothly, the same cannot be said of the carriages. Since they were new, their suspension hadn't been adjusted as well as it could have been. To make matters worse, the track wasn't designed for such high speeds, and much of it was rather poorly maintained. As a result, once the train reached a very high speed, the carriages bucked and swayed quite severely. With characteristic British understatement, it is said that more than a few passengers commented that the ride was quite lively. One of the few people who appeared unconcerned about what was happening was Sir Nigel himself. Apparently, he kept joking with the chief engineer in charge of the permanent way about how his engine was showing up the poor state of your track. It is not recorded what the chief engineer's reply was. Perhaps that's just as well. The publicity run created a huge sensation. Many speed records were smashed on that day. If the train had kept going like this all the way to Newcastle, well, who knows? It would have probably got there in something like 3 hours. That's about the same time as the fastest services take today. Arthur Taylor and Jack Luty continued to work together on the Silver Jubilee for quite some time. While normal service speeds for the high-speed trains were markedly faster than the best expresses of the time, Arthur and Jack never drove at such extremely high speeds again. The state of the track, the limitations of the signalling system, and the lack of braking power on the trains meant that the speed of regular services was quite a lot less. In fact, under normal operating conditions, speeds above 90 miles per hour, 145 kilometres per hour or so, were quite unusual. The Silver Jubilee was a great success. High-speed train services were soon extended to other destinations such as Leeds and Edinburgh. The trains were usually packed with passengers and made a good profit. They set new benchmarks for reliability and on-time performance that have seldom been surpassed since. In 1939, when the Second World War broke out, the service was withdrawn. Sad to say, it never ran again. It's fascinating that in a project that was so ambitious and involved such heavy time pressure, that it was the late delivery of a single small component that led to one of the most remarkable events in railway history.